The importance of video game box art has diminished considerably since the rise of digital game libraries. However, before the internet, a game's box was basically the sales pitch to try and get you to swap the money in your pocket for the gaming delight that lay inside. And would you believe that sometimes publishers didn't exactly print the entire truth on the box? Unbelievable, right? Sometimes you could put these issues down to printing errors, but other times straight up lies would be told just to get the public to bite. So, for this episode, we take a look at these specious shells, this mendacious marketing, and these prevaricative packagings, as I say. But, hello you, I'm Guru Larry, and I welcome you to Fact Hunt, a history of box art lies. Now, before we get into the real meat of the video, we can't have a fact hunt about lying video game boxes and not even mention the countless examples from the 1980s, the British home microcomputers. For example, just bought Turbo Outrun on the ZX Spectrum. All the screenshots on the back are from the Commodore 64 release. Recently purchased a much hyped Robocop home port. All the screenshots on the box are from the arcade version instead. And if you recently acquired Tapper by means of legal tender on the ZX Spectrum, the box had screenshots of some imaginary version of the game which doesn't even exist. Even the magazine print adverts were full of porkies. If you saw the advert for the first Street Fighter game, you'd think they did an amazing job porting the game to the Atari ST. It looks just like the arcade version. And that's because it is the arcade version. The ST game looks absolutely bugger all like that. But instead of spending the next 20 years looking at the thousands of home microcomputer games smothered in bullshot, let's turn our attention to something a little more modern and pursue the second expansion port for World of Warcraft. November 2008 saw the release of Blizzard's The Wrath of the Lich King. This expansion marked World of Warcraft at its absolute popularity apex of 12 million players. After this, both player numbers and the game's overall quality started to fall. Also in 2008, Blizzard was merged with Activision, so something to keep in mind. Anyhow, the Wrath of the Lich King expansion added a lot of cool new features, like a new deathmatch class, an achievement system, and a whole load of new areas to explore. But on the box, players spotted something that absolutely wasn't in the game: aerial dogfights. It's right there though, plastered on the box as a main feature in the game. But it wasn't something that was actually in the game, and it was never added at any point during the expansion's patch cycle. To be fair to Blizzard, although aerial dogfight sounds cool, it probably would have been about as good as the other vehicle sections in the game. Awful. A dungeon added in the expansion called the Oculus featured dragons you could fly around on to travel to different areas of the maps, and players hated it. Blizzard didn't have dogfights ready for launch, then would have seen the feedback from the vehicle sections they had just added into the game, and probably decided to abandon the feature altogether. However, this wasn't even the first time something had been featured on a World of Warcraft box that wasn't actually in the game. The original 2004 vanilla version of the game sported this image on the box, which players immediately recognised as a Demon Hunter character, which not only wasn't in the vanilla version of the game, but Demon Hunters wouldn't get added to World of Warcraft for another 12 years in 2016, when the Legion expansion pack was released, and by that time, no one really cared. Nevertheless, Blizzard isn't alone with these bait and switch character shenanigans either. Sega have also dropped a clanger in that department too. If you played the revolutionary Virtua Fighter in arcades during 1993, not only would you have seen the world's first 3D fighting game, but you would also have seen a big fat lie on the front of the cabinet. Now, it all looks fine and dandy until you get about here, and you have these frankly shocking renditions of the Virtua Fighter character roster. Aside from the fact they look like they were created by a drunken man with an Etch-a-Sketch who had all the fighters described to him over a phone call, once you get to here, oh, that's not a Kira. That's not a Kira in the slightest. That's actually Seba, who some of you might know as a character cut from the game during the last few months of development. He can be seen in preview footage of the game, and by using hacking tools you can actually reinstate his character code, which is actually being left in the final build of the ROM. Gamers would eventually be able to actually play as Seba later on in the Sega Saturn release Fighters Megamix as an unlockable character, thanks to Sega including him in homage to their original screw-up. It's worth noting that this arcade cabinet with the hideous artwork was also only released in America. Here in Europe, we got a far nicer looking Virtua Fighter cabinet, and one that wasn't plastered with falsehoods. Although regional box art with incorrect information on it was a bit of a thing for Sega. I mean, just take a look at the box the Game Gear came in. Here in Europe, we got the graph paper style that had been splashed all over Sega's products up to that point, with an image of Super Monaco GP running on the handheld. However, over in the land of the rising sun, their Game Gear box featured games that were not even on the system at all. Alex Kidd, Cyberball, Afterburner and Moonwalker. Now, yeah, I guess you could let Alex Kidd slide, as it could be played on a Game Gear if you used a Master Gear converter, but although Afterburner and Moonwalker were also on the Master System, those are clearly Mega Drive screenshots shown. And the only Sega console Cyberball was on was the Mega Drive. So, what is Sega trying to pull here? Now, this is clearly Sega just trying to pull a fast one over their customers, possibly hoping that they are too stupid to spot these non-existent titles. But it's not half as stupid as Commodore thought its customers were when they trotted out their CD32 console. For those of you who are unaware, the CD32 was essentially a gimped Amiga A1200 and marketed to the public as the world's first 32-bit CD games console. And it's here that things start to come apart. First of all, yes, technically it did have a 32-bit CPU and data bus, and we'll go into this a bit more in a minute. But what really matters are the games. Nintendo had already released Star Fox on the 16-bit Super Nintendo, and magazines had begun showing an impressive port of Virtua Racing on the 16-bit Sega Mega Drive. So, what sort of next-generation 32-bit games were we seeing on the CD32? Dangerous Streets, a fighting game where the Fonz takes on prostitutes, dinosaurs, and a giant Smurf. I mean, what even is this? If anything, this is a downgrade over the offerings from Sega and Nintendo. However, the reason why the CD32 is in this video is the other part of that tagline on the box, the world's first 32-bit CD games console. The problem here is it was beaten to the market 7 months earlier by the Japanese exclusive FM Towns Marty. The Marty is a consolised version of Fujitsu's FM Towns home computer, and actually had games that look like they are from a very early 32-bit home console. Now, some tried to use the argument that even though the Marty had a 32-bit CPU, it only had a 16-bit data bus. But if you're going to go down that road, the CD32 only had 2 MB of shared RAM throughout the entire system, which meant the CPU was immediately crippled the moment it tried to do anything, which is why you had games that looked like complete arse. You can understand why Commodore would have to lie on the box to shift their awful machine, but more recent systems, such as Sony's PlayStation 5, would practically sell itself. So why did they plaster a completely unbelievable feature onto the box of the PS5? Who knows? But they did. Take a look at the box of a fat PlayStation 5 and you'll notice it proudly claims 8K resolution. The thing is, if you plug a PS5 into an 8K TV, there's no option to actually output in 8K. This has since been removed from the box with the advent of the slim PS5, and even the new PS5 Pro, which you would expect to be capable, is missing the claim. So why on earth did Sony do this? Although 8K is almost definitely not coming in a future firmware update, it's not totally impossible. Hardware-wise, it does have the correct HDMI connection to output at 8K, and Digital Foundry actually found one game that actually does internally render at 8K. But if only one game in the entire console's library is made to support 8K, then it's hardly a feature you can market on the front of the box now, is it? I mean, the PS2 had 4 games that could output in 1080i, and early 2000s Sony never made a peep about that. Okay, so we've so far had spurious screenshots, fraudulent features, dislodged disputants, and even casuistical consoles. But what about the actual artwork on the game itself? Surely that couldn't possibly mislead you, could it? Of course it can. Probably the most famous example of this is Konami's seminal Metal Gear Solid 2 on the PlayStation 2. Dominantly covering about 60% of the entire cover is our old mate Dave, aka Solid Snake. Despite the fact you only play as him for the first 10 minutes of the game before Kojima bait and switches you into playing as a Whinger Ninja Raiden instead. I'd be less mad if it wasn't for the fact you could do all of that by just playing the demo and not have to pay a penny for this nonsense. Mobile Light Force 2 on the PlayStation 2 is also just as bad, not only lazily using the exact artwork seen on the prequel, but these Temu Charlie's Angels on the cover have absolutely bugger all to do with the game itself. Oh, and before anyone brings it up in the comments, the old bloke on the cover of the US version of Phalanx on the SNES was entirely intentional to increase publicity for an otherwise rather bland shoot-'em-up. And considering we're still talking about it 3 decades later, it certainly did its job. If anyone was genuinely misled into buying a game as they wanted to play as an octogenarian banjo-playing hillbilly in a Japanese shmup, then they certainly have more bloody problems going on in their lives than just being incredibly gullible. Anyhow, if it's not the front of the box misleading you, it's also the back too. Just take Sega's 2000 baseball title, World Series Baseball 2K1 for the Dreamcast. Yeah, the console was on its last legs and the game was a bit crap, but proudly proclaiming the game had hot and cold zones, dynamic weather systems and 4 modes of play when it had absolutely none of that was a little bit on the scummy side. But it also explains why Sega never hired WoW Entertainment to make another baseball game for them ever again. What you are watching on screen right now is the PlayStation Vita game Galgun Double Peace, which combines a wafer-thin plotline with the gameplay mechanic of being able to shoot your love gun at various girls. There's no confusion that this game is firmly aimed at the hardcore weeb demographic, from its intro that lays out the game's style choice, to the in-game Doki Doki Touch mode, which uses a Vita's touchscreen in exactly the way you would expect. What you wouldn't expect is for this game to be rated E for everyone on the back of the box of the American version of this game. It did have the correct M rating on the front, but this is still quite the clanger considering the E rating is paired with the text sexual content. Hilariously, quite a few copies managed to slip through Sony's fingers before they finally put out a reissue with the correct age rating on the box. Good one, Sony. What better way to wrap up this episode with none other than the absolute kings of screwing you over, Electronic Arts, and their box art to Jungle Strike. The second of the 16-bit isometric helicoptering series had you flying your Huey around the climate rainforests of, Washington DC. But alas, all the fun of this capital copter chaparral was only available to a single player at the time. Well, unless you had a PAL copy of the game, as it proudly boasted it was a 2-player title. It was correctly printed as a single-player title in the US and Japanese versions, but did the European version have an exclusive 2-player mode? No, it was just the usual bollocks from EA. Thanks EA, over 4 decades of constantly trying to rip us off. That's some record there. Unfortunately, all these blatant falsehoods are merely the tip of the iceberg when it comes to fraudulent facades. If you have any good ones I didn't mention in today's episode, be sure to jot them down in the comments. Hello you! Thanks ever so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe to be first to see future Fact Hunt episodes. Click on the bell if you already are to make sure you're notified, and be sure to check out my other episodes. And if you want to be super awesome, check out my Patreon. But thanks again for watching, and until next time friends, I'm missing you already.